American timeline of American history, and I was also going to get some prosperity data, but I'm going to just have to wing that because I can't find the textbook with all my notes in it. And it was a wonderful old book, and I know I brought it, I'm pretty sure. And so on. It was a history of the United States from the very beginning, from the first settlers and even some of the explorers and settlements that didn't succeed through 1890, and gave statistical information and so on for each year. So it was a perfect thing to see, for example, how wars always raised the cost of government. Well, that's pretty obvious. But anyway, we'll just have to kind of deal with that in a little bit off the cuff from what I remember. But going back, what I did here is put up two boards. The first one goes by the 100 years, and then the second one, I chose a beginning year of 1912, and then jumped by 20s, but inserted a lot of things that happened in between. So first permanent European settlements in America, Jamestown, 1607. Actually, I guess I should have gone back one more. There was St. Augustine in Florida that's older than these. That was a Spanish settlement, and it doesn't tie into our usual history in the same way. That wasn't part of the original United States. Anyway, 1607, Jamestown, Virginia, and you've probably read some of the stories about that settlement. And then 1620, the Pilgrim Separatists arrived, and I put a little asterisk, including shirtlift ancestor, or ancestors as the case may be, and the Mayflower Compact. And I think that was read to you in one of your classes a couple nights ago, the one on American federalism. But basically, that is the first document in history where a group of people specifically set out to govern themselves and drew it up as a document. Around 1639, I believe it was, Harvard University was established, and its purpose was to prepare preachers, and the Latin slogan for it or whatever was something like Veritas in Ecclesia or something. It was like truth in the church, but shortly they dropped the church part. Okay, now moving on, 1700, nothing specific that year that I have, but three key people were born in the first half of the 1700s. 1706, Benjamin Franklin, and of course he was very important in our founding. He was also our premier diplomat. He lived many years abroad, serving in England and in France. And there are excellent books out now which debunk a lot of the revisionist history and biography information. And there was a certain amount of tragedy in his life in the sense that his son had become a colonial governor, and when the revolution came, they were on different sides of the war. Now, neither one of them actually fought battles, but still, it'd be like if somebody in your family were against your most cherished beliefs and so on. It's heart-wrenching. 1732, George Washington was born. And of course, I think you all know a lot about George Washington, and one of the key things that he did really was inspire people and hold them together through thick and thin, and it was mostly thin during the American Revolution, when they weren't getting their pay, they weren't getting their supplies, the Continental Congress wasn't seeing to it that the troops were taken care of, and he's very famous, among other things, for his stint at Valley Forge, when the men were near starvation, and often, their shoes wore out. There were no cobblers there to replace them, no money to replace them, and so on. And he managed to inspire tremendous loyalty and keep things together throughout that long Revolutionary War. 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born. And of course, a couple of the most famous things about him involved the fact that he basically wrote the Declaration of Independence. It was a committee. But of course, as you know, if any of you have been involved in committees or team projects in school or whatever, typically somebody takes the bull by the horns and really does the work. And then, you know, they may vote on some details later, but that's one of the things. And the other for which he's, or one other for which he's very famous, is the Louisiana Purchase. Because there was a case where a huge mass of land from Louisiana north and out the Mississippi, or along the Mississippi and Missouri rivers, clear to the Pacific Ocean. That huge chunk of land, and you can find it on some of your borders, on the Louisiana borders. That huge chunk of land didn't have to be conquered through warfare. It was purchased from France for, I believe, $3 million. Now, of course, those dollars were gold and they were really worth something. Anyway, those are some key dates for that time. And then leading into the Revolutionary period, and I know there's lots of important things that happened, but each one of them took time, and if we had to go through them all, we'd need a couple hundred years to get it done. 1773, I believe, December, was the Boston Tea Party. 1775 on the Lexington Green, and that was, by the way, an answer on one of your entry quiz questions on which village green was the shot heard around the world fired, or something like that, or the beginning of the Revolutionary War. Okay, now 1776, two things of extreme importance happened. One happened over in Europe, in Bavaria, part of southern Germany. In May of 1776, an individual named Adam Weishaupt started an organization called the Illuminati. They were the ones that supposedly had light, and they were going to bring light to the world. Well, whenever you hear stuff like that, you can begin to smell a conspiracy, or at least a great deal of arrogance, because who was it said, "Let there be light"?
God.
God. Okay, so anybody else that's going to bring light is probably some kind of imposter, right? So anyway, the other big event, of course, in 1776 was the writing and signing of the Declaration of Independence, and July 4th was the day chosen to commemorate the signing of it. Then, of course, once we had declared independence, we're no longer recognizing the British governors and officers and so on. So we have to set up our own, and the Continental Congress arranged for the writing of, and this is kind of a separate subject, but you can actually look up the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union on the internet, if you Google it or something if you're interested, and you can see that was like a forerunner to the Constitution, and it was a much looser federation, and it did not provide, for example, for the coining of money. So during the whole Revolutionary War era, and until even after the peace, until the establishment of our present Constitution, the states had no stable currency necessarily. Some states, Massachusetts being one of them, retained specie money. In other words, they had the real gold and silver money. But not everybody had it. The people in Boston, the tradespeople and so on, had gold and silver. The folks out in the country didn't, and that was part of the problem when somebody got the bright idea of having property taxes, and these farmers were going to be losing their property and so on. And by the way, they were a little ahead of the communists on that curve because, well, we'll get to that in a minute, but property tax is a fundamentally communist idea, even though some people had thought of it before the manifesto was published. Okay, so then we had the War for Independence, and it was not a revolution in anything like the sense of most revolutions, which are very unduly bloody, shall we say. Yes, there were battles and so on, but there weren't these horrible bloodbaths and drowning of citizens and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so the War for Independence actually lasted until about 1781, and the peace treaty was finally concluded in 1783. So they limped along. They had, actually, there were 7 presidents, I believe, of the United States prior to George Washington, but they were the United States under the Articles of Confederation. And that's why on your entry exam, the question read as it did, who was the first president of the United States under the U.S. Constitution? And of course, that was George Washington. So he's commonly known as the first president, but if you want to get technical, there were these other presidents who served 1-year terms in the under the Articles of Confederation. So, in 1787, partly spurred by the propaganda surrounding Shays' Rebellion and so on, they were able to get enough delegates to meet in Philadelphia for a con-con. What's a con-con?
Constitutional Convention.
Yes, a constitutional convention. And given the fact that their assignment at this convention was simply to amend the Articles of Confederation, you can see that that is precedent for a total revolutionary change to our Constitution if we're ever to give in to the people who are now asking for a con-con. And this is coming up. I've been hearing it on radio and so on, and I'm sure some of you and some of the instructors and so on have been hearing calls for it also. And there's a lot of people that are so ignorant of American history, they don't begin to realize the danger they could put this country in by having a constitutional convention. With a general level of education on Americanist issues, what kind of people would be elected? I mean, would they be, okay, let's turn this around, that's kind of too open-ended. Would you get really good constitutional scholars in all likelihood, or would you get very popular glad-handers who run good campaigns and have lots of money? Number 2, yeah, you'd get the second. So it would be a very bad idea to have the country that just elected Obama and thought about electing Hillary and so on, to have those people choosing delegates to write a new constitution. I mean, they would probably draw it right straight from the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto nowadays. Anyway, another very important thing happened in 1787. It was a key year. The Constitutional Convention met from May to September, and in that time, they crafted that document, which you've been studying off and on all week, and will continue to do